The Washington family has deep roots in England, going all the way back to the Norman Conquest. Back then, a lot of land and privileges in Durham County were given to the followers of William the Conqueror and their descendants. Among the high-ranking officials in Durham, there were barons and knights who held land and had to maintain peace and fight when needed. One of these knights was William de Hertburn, an ancestor of the Washingtons. He acquired the village and manor of Wessington through land exchanges and changed his last name to Wessington. Over time, the name Wessington evolved into Washington, and various branches of the family spread out. One branch settled at Sulgrave Manor. A direct descendant, Sir William Washington, married the sister of George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham. The Duke was a favorite of King Charles I, which linked the Sulgrave Washingtons closely with the Stuart dynasty. As royalists, the Washington family's fortunes declined after King Charles was overthrown. In 1655, a noble revolt led to severe punishment from Cromwell. Many nobles, even those who didn't participate, were forced to flee to avoid persecution. This led John and Andrew Washington to move to the North American colony of Virginia. For those loyal to the exiled king and the Church of England, Virginia was a safe haven. John married a local woman named Anne Pope, became a planter, and held roles such as local magistrate and member of the Virginia House of Burgesses. John led Virginia troops alongside Maryland forces against Seneca Indians, disrupting settlements along the Potomac. In honor of his service, the parish where he lived was named Washington Parish. John's grandson, George Washington's father, was named Augustine. He married twice. His first marriage was on April 20th, 1715, to Jane Butler, and they had 4 children, but only Lawrence and Augustine Jr. survived to adulthood. Jane died on November 24, 1728. Augustine remarried on March 6, 1730, to Mary Ball, and they had 4 sons, George, Samuel, John Augustine, and Charles, and 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Mildred, who died young. There's a famous story about young George Washington and his father that shows George's honesty. When George was about 6, he loved chopping things with a hatchet. One day, in his mother Mary's garden, he accidentally chopped down a beautiful English cherry tree. The next morning, Augustine saw the damaged tree and asked who did it, saying he wouldn't have sold the tree for any price. George, holding the hatchet, stepped forward. Augustine asked, "George, do you know who chopped down the beautiful cherry tree in the garden?" George hesitated for a moment, then looked at his father with sincere eyes and said, "I cannot tell a lie, Dad. I did cut it with my hatchet." Augustine, overjoyed, exclaimed, "Although you cut down my cherry tree, your honesty is worth more to me." The Washington family lived on a plantation in rural Virginia. Their house was nestled between lush tobacco fields and flower-filled pastures, surrounded by barns, livestock sheds, and cottages, making it look like a small village. However, their nearest neighbors were miles away. There were no railroads or stagecoaches, so any trip required crossing dense forests or taking a small boat along the river. With no trashy novels, toy stores, computers, cell phones, or concerts, young George Washington had to focus on outdoor activities. George attended a country school where his education was limited to reading, writing, and arithmetic. Back then, Virginia didn't have good schools, and people didn't really care much about education. Wealthy families often sent their eldest sons to good schools in England to learn some gentlemanly manners. George's father, Augustine, had studied at Appleby School in England when he was young. George's half-brothers, Lawrence and Augustine Jr., were also sent to Appleby School. For most kids, just being able to read, write, and do some basic math was enough. In 1742, Augustine died when George was only 11 years old. The family faced financial difficulties, and George and his siblings needed their mother Mary's care. His half-brothers, Lawrence and Augustine Jr., were already married, so Mary needed George's help running the plantation. This forced George to drop out of school early, missing out on a proper gentleman's education. Mary was strict and critical of George, often denying him encouragement. She even refused Lawrence's offer to get George a position as a midshipman in the Royal Navy, which strained their relationship. George often went to Lawrence's house to escape. Even after George became commander-in-chief and president, Mary didn't show much pride in his achievements. In 1781, during the Revolutionary War, Mary petitioned the legislature for an emergency pension. embarrassing George as it suggested she relied on public charity despite him sending her enough money. Mary passed away at 81, leaving George 400 acres of valuable pine land and 2 slaves as part of his inheritance, indicating she had accumulated significant property and owned up to 10 slaves. George's brother Lawrence had already made a name for himself by participating in the War of Jenkins' Ear. After inheriting part of their father's plantation, Lawrence renamed it Mount Vernon. He married Anne Fairfax, the daughter of Colonel William Fairfax, and they had a daughter. William Fairfax's home was near Mount Vernon, and his cousin, Lord Fairfax, often visited, bringing George along for hunting trips. Despite his limited formal education, George spent his free time reading and teaching himself, shaping himself into a disciplined and polite country gentleman. Lawrence and Lord Fairfax saw potential in George and valued him highly. George knew that much of Virginia's wealth came from rampant land speculation, so he apprenticed there, a well-known and profitable career. Lord Fairfax owned vast lands in northern Neck, Virginia, which were overrun by squatters. He needed someone to survey these lands to either evict the squatters or make them agree to fair terms. Impressed by George's surveying records at Mount Vernon, Lord Fairfax encouraged him to survey the wilderness. At 16, George set off on horseback with his friends, crossing the Blue Ridge Mountains into the Shenandoah Valley. The journey involved navigating through storms, primitive paths, and rivers in dugout canoes. George hunted wild turkeys, slept under the stars or in smoky tents on bearskins, and even slept on a flea-infested blanket heavier than the blanket itself. This month-long adventure exposed George to a rugged and violent world, which he quickly adapted to, laying the groundwork for his future in the French and Indian War. In the following years, the British and French clashed over land along the Ohio River. The French claimed all land in the Mississippi River Basin, not just settling down from Canada, but also marrying into Native American tribes. The British, on the other hand, believed they had bought all the land in the western mountains and northern Ohio from the Native Americans. To resolve this land dispute, in 1747, Lawrence, his father-in-law, and other prominent landowners and merchants in the Northern Neck created the Ohio Company of Virginia. Unfortunately, Lawrence soon contracted tuberculosis and eventually passed away. In his will, he named George as the third inheritor and manager of Mount Vernon, recognizing George's qualities of self-control, diligence, and a focus on agricultural efficiency, knowing he wouldn't succumb to the temptations of rum. By 1753, 20-year-old George Washington had lobbied to fill the vacant adjutant position in the Northern Neck after Lawrence's death, putting him at the forefront of the impending global conflict. At that time, the British colonies in North America were mainly along the East Coast, stretching across the Atlantic and the Appalachian Mountains. French colonies extended from New Orleans southwestward through the Mississippi River into the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River. The governor of French Canada, Marquis de Duquesne, announced plans to build forts between Lake Erie and the Ohio River system to strengthen France's claim from Canada to the Mississippi, forming a continuous crescent. Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie, a major investor in the Ohio Company, decided to send Washington to deliver a final ultimatum to the French, following Lord Fairfax's recommendation. First, Washington was ordered to connect with the chief of the Native American tribe, the Half-King, and gather intelligence on French activities. Washington and his party then reached Fort Le Boeuf, a makeshift fort of 4 structures made from bark and planks. Washington noted the 220 birch and pine canoes lined along the creek, ready for French military action, and suspected the French had bribed other Native Americans with guns and alcohol. After delivering the ultimatum to the French to leave the Ohio Valley, Washington quickly returned with the French commander's reply. Along the way, he waded through icy streams and trekked through snow-covered forests. In January 1754, after receiving the French's refusal to surrender to British threats, Governor Dinwiddie appointed Washington as a lieutenant colonel to recruit and train 100 militia. In April, Washington got devastating news. The French had gathered 1,000 soldiers, 360 boats and canoes, and 18 cannons, forcing the British building a fort at the Forks to surrender. Undeterred, Washington followed orders. leading 160 inexperienced soldiers to Redstone Creek on the Monongahela River. On the morning of May 28th, Washington received word from the Half King about 35 Frenchmen camped near Great Meadows. Washington and the Half King moved to surround them. The valley soon echoed with gunfire. In just 15 minutes, 10 Frenchmen were dead, 21 were captured, while Washington's side had only 1 dead and a few wounded. The most controversial casualty was 35-year-old Ensign Jumonville, who was supposedly carrying an important diplomatic message to the British, asking them to leave Ohio. This incident turned a local skirmish into a global affair. The French claimed Jumonville was a respected envoy, but the British had treacherously killed him. Washington explained to Governor Dinwiddie that the French were acting more like spies and assassins, scouting for campsites, not ambassadors. Regardless, this dramatic battle thrust Washington into the spotlight, setting the stage for future events. Later, the Half King, believing the British couldn't win against the French, ended their brief alliance. On June 14th, Captain James Mackay from South Carolina showed up with 100 soldiers to back up Washington. Mackay was a higher-ranking officer directly appointed by the Royal Commission, while Washington's rank was granted by the Virginia governor. This meant Mackay didn't have to follow Washington's orders, which made him act superior. Plus, he earned more than the colonial militia, making Washington frustrated with the unequal treatment. By June 28th, Washington ordered his exhausted soldiers to retreat and set up at a poorly chosen, easily invaded spot called Fort Necessity. This fort could only hold 60 to 70 men, so Washington dug 3-foot trenches around it to protect more people. But Fort Necessity was on low, swampy ground that turned into a muddy mess when it rained. It was surrounded by woods and high ground, making it easy for enemies to attack. The fort was open to the sky, with no shelter from the elements. The French army was led by Captain Louis Coulon de Villiers, who was eager to avenge his brother Jumonville's death. On July 3, 1754, de Villiers launched a fierce attack on Fort Necessity. It poured rain, flooding the trenches and trapping the soldiers in their own defenses. With no cover and wet gunpowder, Washington's men couldn't fire their weapons. The scene was grim. About 100 men were killed or wounded, by nearly a third of Washington's troops. The French lost only 3 men, with 17 wounded. Eventually, Washington had to sign a surrender document. Later, he discovered the document, due to translation issues, described Jumonville's death as an assassination, which he never agreed to. This caused an uproar and put Washington at the center of another international dispute. However, over the next few weeks, public criticism turned into recognition of the hardships he faced at Fort Necessity. By early September, the House of Burgesses praised Washington and Mackay for their bravery. Feeling disheartened by the unfair treatment over his rank, Washington resigned from the army in October. Still, he wanted to continue his military career. In February 1755, Major General Edward Braddock was sent from Britain to lead the fight against the French. Recognizing Washington's unmatched knowledge of the frontier, Braddock invited him to join his staff as a volunteer aide. Though Washington still dreamed of a permanent commission in the regular army, Braddock could only offer him a temporary rank. Weighing his options, Washington accepted the position. Braddock's nearly 3,000 men set out in early June, heading for Fort Cumberland, an old trading post on Wills Creek along the Potomac River. Stubbornly sticking to European military tactics, Braddock insisted on bringing his entire artillery and thousands of bushels of grain, making for slow progress. Just 2 miles a day. Washington suggested they move faster, but Braddock only partially agreed, sending an advance party of 800 men ahead. With the French at Fort Duquesne constantly strengthening their defenses, time was running out for the British. By mid-June, Washington came down with dysentery, suffering severe diarrhea and painful hemorrhoids, leaving him too weak to ride, forcing him to travel in a covered wagon. Braddock ensured Washington got the best medical care, and after 4 days of treatment, he began to recover. On the morning of July 9th, Braddock's vanguard, now about 1,400 men, crossed the Monongahela River in 3 groups near present-day Braddock, Pennsylvania. Suddenly, 900 French soldiers and Native Americans attacked. Like at Fort Necessity, the French and their native allies used guerrilla tactics, hiding behind trees and rocks. The British, unaccustomed to this type of warfare, panicked. Washington urged Braddock to fight in the woods, but Braddock stubbornly stuck to European close-order drills, lining up his men, making them easy targets. The British troops were in chaos, but Virginia militiamen, familiar with this brutal fighting style, calmly shot back from behind trees. Washington, despite his hemorrhoid pain, rode back and forth, trying to rally the panicked regulars and recover 2 lost cannons. His 6-foot frame made him a huge target, yet he miraculously stayed unharmed, even as 2 horses were shot from under him and 4 bullets tore through his hat and coat. In this battle, nearly 1,000 British officers were killed or wounded, compared to just a few dozen French and native casualties. Braddock was hit by a bullet that went through his arm and pierced his lungs. Washington placed him in a small cart and escorted him back across the Monongahela River. All night, the British fled, with Washington and the Virginia troops covering the rear to protect the wounded general. The French and natives, having won a decisive victory, didn't pursue. On the night of July 13th, Braddock died 2 miles from the Great Meadows. Despite the defeat, Washington emerged as a fearless young soldier who never backed down, solidifying his indelible reputation. By mid-August 1755, the Williamsburg Assembly voted to allocate 40,000 pounds to protect the colony's frontiers from enemy threats. Governor Dinwiddie appointed 23-year-old Washington not only as a colonel of the Virginia Regiment, but also as the commander-in-chief of all Virginia forces. Washington set up his headquarters in Winchester, the largest town on the frontier, which was well positioned for travel to other parts of the colony. The new recruits were pretty undisciplined and lazy. By October 1755, he and Dinwiddie lobbied the Virginia Assembly to pass a law allowing deserters, traitors, and insubordinates to be sentenced to death. Washington established strict moral standards for his troops, and his use of corporal punishment expanded, especially for soldiers who frequently got drunk. However, the issue of colonial officers being ranked lower than those appointed by the Crown persisted. A colonial captain from Maryland, John Dagworthy, was assigned by royal officers to oversee Washington's work. Dagworthy's rank was lower than Washington's, but he claimed higher authority based on an old royal commission. Defending the frontier gave Washington no sense of honor, making him consider resigning. Meanwhile, Britain shifted the main focus of the war to Canada, clearly relegating Virginia to a secondary role in the imperial strategy. In March 1758, Britain sent a fleet of 7,000 men to North America, planning an operation against Fort Duquesne. The new commander, Brigadier General John Forbes, was an experienced Scottish officer who didn't think much of colonial officers. By now, Washington was used to this kind of prejudice and bounced back, offering to serve under General Forbes. When Forbes arrived, he took up Braddock's unfinished mission. General Forbes devised a plan to attack Fort Duquesne, assigning Washington to lead one of the 3 assault brigades. Initially, Forbes planned to delay the attack until the following spring, but 3 prisoners revealed that the French garrison was now under strength. Then, an Indian scout reported seeing thick smoke rising from the fort. Forbes mustered 2,500 men to take the fort, granting Washington the honorary rank of brigadier general. When they arrived on November 25, 1758, they found only the charred remains of Fort Duquesne. The French, abandoned by their Indian allies, had deemed the fort indefensible, so they blew it up and retreated down the Ohio River under cover of night. The fall of Fort Duquesne at the end of November 1758 ended the conflict and danger on the southern frontier, marking the end of French control over the Ohio Valley. All the Indian tribes signed peace treaties, pledging allegiance to the British. After this, Washington chose to resign and return to Mount Vernon to become a plantation owner. He also actively pursued a political career. Around this time, Lawrence's daughter Sarah and widow Anne both passed away, making Washington the owner of Mount Vernon as per Lawrence's will. In 1758, Washington was introduced to Martha Dandridge, a widow. Her husband, Daniel Parke Custis, had died the previous July, leaving behind 4 children, 2 of whom had also passed away. Washington pursued Martha, and their relationship quickly blossomed into marriage. Martha was quite wealthy, owning thousands of acres around Williamsburg, nearly 300 slaves, and hundreds of cattle, pigs, and sheep. Since Daniel Parke Custis died intestate without a will, English common law dictated that Martha could only claim 1/3 of his estate during her lifetime. Therefore, she only owned 85 slaves, known as dower, slaves who would return to her son, Jackie Custis, after her death. The remaining 2/3 of the estate were reserved for the children's financial support, with George as the guardian. This catapulted Washington into the top tier of Virginia's plantation owners. Although Martha and George had no children together, this eventually helped him earn the title of the father of his country. By the end of 1768, Britain negotiated 2 treaties with the Native Americans, reopening Ohio to settlers and sparking a frenzy of real estate speculation. Washington reminded Dinwiddie of the 200,000 acres of bounty land promised to veterans of the Fort Necessity campaign back in 1754. By the end of 1769, amid a temporary reconciliation in Williamsburg, Washington persuaded Lord Boudetort to honor this promise. The governor and the assembly designated the confluence of the Ohio and Kanawha rivers as the location for these bounty lands. Washington organized a meeting of veterans and convinced them to select William Crawford as the surveyor for these lands. Using his position, Washington secured prime real estate for himself and secretly bought rights from impoverished veterans to expand his holdings. By 1773, he owned over 30,000 acres along the Ohio and Kanawha rivers, making him a major landowner in the West on the eve of the American Revolution. On February 10, 1763, Great Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal signed a treaty, officially ending the North American conflict and the global 7 Years' War. However, the repercussions of the war sowed seeds of conflict that would erupt 12 years later. With increased military expenses, Britain's national debt had ballooned to an astonishing £130 million, with annual interest payments of £4.5 million, consuming over half the national budget. To shift this tax burden onto the American colonies, the British government introduced the Stamp Act and other unpopular measures. Enacted in 1765, the Stamp Act taxed legal documents, newspapers, almanacs, and even playing cards. All legal documents required a stamp to be valid, leading some colonial courts to shut down. The colonists widely resented this, and the act was repealed 4 months after its implementation. This sparked a growing desire for independence from British control across North America. Failing to learn from the Stamp Act, Britain passed the Townshend Acts in 1767, further angering the colonies by imposing duties on paint, glass, paper, and tea. This led to a colonial boycott of British imports. The mutual resentment escalated, culminating in the Boston Massacre on March 5, 1770. After a British officer purchased a wig, store clerk Edward Garrick mistakenly believed the officer hadn't paid and yelled at him. The officer's subordinate, Private Hugh White, took offense and got into an argument with Garrick, eventually striking him. As Garrick bled and cried out, an angry crowd surrounded White. Captain Thomas Preston and several soldiers arrived to rescue White, but were pelted with stones and attacked by the mob. In the chaos, the soldiers opened fire, killing 5 civilians and wounding 6 others. On December 16, 1773, a group of patriots disguised as Mohawk Indians threw 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. Contrary to popular belief, the tea tax wasn't punitive. In fact, the colonists' cost for tea decreased. However, by eliminating smugglers and colonial middlemen, it consolidated the East India Company's monopoly, threatening local merchants and perpetuating the hated practice of taxation without representation. A few months later, Parliament passed the Boston Port Act, closing the port until the tea was paid for. This harsh retaliation united the colonies, leading to the First Continental Congress, where all colonies sent representatives. George Washington was elected as one of the 7 delegates from Virginia to attend the meeting in Philadelphia. The spark that ignited the War of Independence was the Battle of Lexington. On April 14, 1775, General Gage received orders from London to arrest the rebellion leaders and planned to seize a munitions cache in nearby Concord. Patriots got wind of the raid and sent Paul Revere to warn Adams and Hancock. On April 19th, when a large British force arrived on Lexington Green, they encountered a small but determined group of volunteers. Shots were fired. 8 Americans were killed, 10 wounded, and the British continued to Concord. However, as the Redcoats returned to Boston, they were ambushed by armed farmers known as Minutemen, who fired accurately from behind trees, buildings, and fences. By the time the panicked British soldiers scrambled back to town, they had suffered 273 casualties, while the colonists lost 95 men. On May 25th, the HMS Cerberus arrived in Boston Harbor with 32 artillery pieces and 3 major generals, John Burgoyne, Henry Clinton, and William Howe. The North American colonies formed the Continental Army, and 43-year-old Washington was chosen as its commander-in-chief. Several reasons explain Washington's election as commander-in-chief. First, his prior experience as Virginia's commander during the French and Indian War, and his 16 years as a legislator made him highly experienced. Second, as a wealthy plantation owner, he was unlikely to be swayed by British bribes. Third, other experienced candidates like Horatio Gates and Charles Lee had served in the British military, making them less trustworthy. Fourth, Virginia, the most populous colony, felt the commander should come from their state, and appointing Washington alleviated Southern fears of a despotic New England general. For reference, New England is a geographic and cultural region in the northeastern United States, comprising 6 states: Connecticut, Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Vermont. It's one of the oldest regions in the U.S., first settled by English Puritans in the early 17th century. In June, Washington set off from Philadelphia to Boston, escorted by a troop of horsemen. Along the way, folks from various towns came out to greet his procession. Once he got to Boston, the British stayed holed up in their fortifications, so the Continental Army had to settle for laying siege to the city. Washington's first major headache was training raw recruits into soldiers, only to see them disappear once their 1-year enlistment was up. Officers were reduced to acting as drill sergeants, and just when the men got the hang of things, they'd leave. Some states offered higher enlistment bonuses for their militia, and soldiers exploited this by leaving one unit and joining another to collect the new bonus. Washington preferred a draft and criticized New Englanders for acting like mercenaries. New recruits haggled for more money, better clothes, and more leave before re-enlisting. One army would disband, and another would have to be formed in its place. Meanwhile, Lord Dunmore announced that slaves or indentured servants who fled their rebel masters could join his Royal Ethiopian Regiment and earn their freedom. Around 800 escaped slaves quickly rallied to his cause, wearing British uniforms with "Liberty to Slaves" emblazoned on them. Unfortunately, many of the first wave of escapees died from smallpox on ships cruising the Virginia rivers. By late December 1775, the Continental Congress made an extraordinary decision, allowing free blacks to re-enlist. This was a watershed moment in U.S. history, opening the door for black soldiers to serve in the Continental Army. Washington was also keen on preventing smallpox from spreading among his troops. He set up isolation hospitals and conducted regular inspections. In the fall of 1775, when smallpox broke out in British-occupied Boston, Washington feared it would spread to his forces. He ordered soldiers who hadn't had smallpox to get inoculated, believing disease posed a greater threat than enemy gunfire. When General William Howe forced 300 sick, impoverished Bostonians onto ships and dumped them near American lines, Washington worried they carried smallpox. He sent humanitarian supplies while carefully quarantining them from his troops. After a second wave of 150 severely ill Bostonians was expelled, Washington became convinced Howe intended to use smallpox as a biological weapon against his army. 47-year-old General Howe had fought bravely in Quebec during the French and Indian War and personally risked his life at the Battle of Bunker Hill. However, he was also notorious for his gambling and womanizing, believing the American war shouldn't interfere with his indulgent lifestyle. His mistress in North America was Boston-born Elizabeth Lloyd Loring, and he appointed her husband, Joshua Loring Jr., as the commissary of prisoners. The opportunistic Joshua was willing to be cuckolded, acting as a pimp for his wife, who became infamously known as the Sultana of the British Army. Someone once remarked, Joshua had no objections. He counted the money while the general enjoyed the lady. On January 14, 1776, Washington informed John Hancock that the American munitions situation was dire. 3 days later, Henry Knox returned to camp with good news. After a 2-month absence, he reported the arrival of heavy artillery. He had transported these weapons 300 miles from Fort Ticonderoga. Astonishingly, Knox had brought nearly 60 cannons and mortars, weighing about 120,000 pounds, and mounted them on 42 huge sledges. Through the increasingly deep December snow, teams of oxen hauled these heavy guns over mountain passes, across frozen rivers, and along village lanes, much to the astonishment of onlookers. The arrival of Ticonderoga's cannons was a godsend, but Washington was still desperately short of gunpowder and arms. 2,000 men had no muskets or ammunition, each with fewer than 30 rounds. Benjamin Franklin even suggested arming the troops with bows and arrows. The key was to fortify Dorchester Heights to the south, which could be used to defeat the British. This strategic high ground, over 100 feet tall, remained unfortified. Logistics remained challenging. How to build fortifications on frozen ground? How to transport Ticonderoga's cannons to the heights within full view and range of enemy guns. The plan was to move the cannons into place under the cover of darkness. The noise of the operation would be masked by continuous volleys from Roxbury, the Neck, and Lechmere's Point, with wagon wheels muffled by straw. To block the British view, the Patriots would set up screens of hay bales. Washington and his generals devised a clever plan to prefabricate fortifications elsewhere and just transport them to the heights. He also arranged barrels filled with dirt in front of the ramparts to give a false impression of overwhelming strength. These handy props could also be rolled thunderously down on any British foolish enough to charge up the slope. At midnight on March 2nd, the Patriots launched a feint attack with artillery fire on the British, who responded with deafening cannonade. This exchange continued into the next night. On March 4th, under the cover of a light fog below the heights but bright moonlight above, Washington on horseback supervised the operation. His familiar figure was visible to his men. Under the cover of the gunfire and flashes, General John Thomas oversaw 3,000 soldiers and ox teams dragging cannons, heavy barrels, and prefabricated fortifications up the steep inclines. The ground, covered with 2 feet of ice, was as hard as rock. The covering force split into 2 groups, one moving to the nearest position to Boston, and the other to the one nearest to Nook's Hill. Under engineer Gridley's direction, the work crews began constructing the fortifications. By the time the relief force arrived at 4 a.m., the fortifications were already taking shape. Commander-in-Chief Washington was right there, overseeing the work. On the morning of March 5th, the British saw the miracle that had occurred overnight on the heights. Dorchester Heights had turned into a fully fortified position, making their stay in Boston untenable. Seeing the assembled American cannons, a bewildered General Howe exclaimed, "My God, these fellows have done more work in one night than my whole army would have done in 3 months." Although the British were largely unmolested, for Washington, this was the first victory of the War of Independence. On the night of March 9th, Howe launched a thunderous cannonade against Dorchester Heights, firing 700 shells in an attempt to cover the British troops' urgent evacuation. The British threw broken cannon and barrels of provisions into the sea to prevent them from falling into Patriot hands. Desperate loyalists surged towards overloaded ships in chaotic scenes. Amid distant Patriot cheers, 9,000 redcoats and numerous loyalists boarded a fleet of 120 ships stretching 9 miles and left Boston. The Continental Army then occupied the city and controlled its key positions, raising the 13 striped flags of the United Colonies over all the forts. Before the British fleet could even set sail for Nova Scotia, Washington guessed their next move would be to New York. As soon as the Redcoats left, he informed Congress that he'd immediately lead the remaining troops to New York. If the British took control of the Hudson River, they could effectively cut off the crucial link between Canada and New York City, splitting the northern and southern colonies. And the Tories had a stronghold in New York as well. Washington began his southward march on April 4th. However, the very features that made New York a magnificent port also turned it into a military nightmare for its defenders. Almost no piece of land could escape being surrounded and bombarded by British ships. In hindsight, the city was doomed to fall, but Washington saw it as a vital stronghold. By the time Washington arrived in New York on April 13th, the city was gripped by fear, leading many residents to flee. Washington took great care to prevent his troops stationed in Manhattan from abusing the New Yorkers. He warned his soldiers not to trample the crops in the fields, aiming to win the support of local farmers, understanding the political significance of the war. A tougher issue to manage was the soldiers frequently visiting the red light district, with up to 500 prostitutes gathering nightly on the grounds of Trinity Church. STDs were spreading through several regiments, weakening them even before the enemy arrived. Washington had his soldiers build twin forts on the rocky highlands up the Hudson River, naming them Fort Washington and Fort Lee. These outposts were meant to prevent the British from turning the river into a corridor to Canada. Washington knew his position in New York was highly unfavorable. To fend off naval attacks, he blocked the ends of each street and set up barriers offshore to prevent British ships from approaching. By early June, the Continental Army had positioned 121 cannons in Manhattan, along the New Jersey shore, on Governor's Island, and in Brooklyn, ready to bombard the British fleet. On June 17, 1776, the New York Provincial Congress received a shocking report from a loyalist named Isaiah Ketchum, who had been arrested for forgery. While detained at City Hall, Ketchum accused two of Washington's personal guards, Thomas Hickey and Michael Lynch, of conspiring with the British to sabotage the Continental Army's defense of New York. These men claimed that when British warships anchored in the harbor, Royal Governor William Tryon would grant royal pardons to defectors. As the investigation widened, it was discovered that a blacksmith named Gilbert Forbes was assigned to pay the traitors, and the funds came from New York's mayor, David Matthews. Once Washington learned of these accusations, he acted swiftly, arresting Matthews at 1 a.m. at his home in Flatbush. During interrogation, Matthews admitted that Governor Tryon had given him a bundle of bills to pass on to Forbes to purchase rifles and muskets. Matthews pointed out Thomas Hickey. Once the plot was exposed, there was intense retaliation against the Tories in New York. Some were tarred and feathered, while others were subjected to the harsh punishment of riding the rail. When Hickey's court-martial began, the conspirators' plan was to sabotage Patriot guns in exchange for pardons and bonuses when the British fleet arrived. A witness testified that 700 Patriots had pledged to defect. One particularly alarming claim was that no fewer than 8 members of Washington's personal guard were involved in the plot. Hickey showed no remorse and was found guilty of inciting mutiny and sedition, sentenced to hang. Washington also believed that 200 to 250 Loyalist conspirators were hiding in the woods and swamps of Long Island. He ordered boats to patrol the strait at night to intercept anyone attempting to escape to British-held Staten Island. To set an example, Washington ordered every brigade to witness Hickey's execution on June 28, 1776, at 11 a.m. The gallows were erected in a field near Bowery, and a crowd of 20,000 came out to watch, nearly the entire population of New York at the time. By the summer of 1776, Patriot sentries on Staten Island signaled to Washington, reporting the sighting of 40 British ships near Sandy Hook, the first ships of the fleet that would soon pass through the Narrows into New York Harbor. These ships had evacuated Boston in March and then sailed south to New York after stopping in Halifax. Major General William Howe was still in command. Some British ships anchored at Gravesend on Long Island, and British soldiers set up camp on Staten Island, but they didn't launch an attack. General Howe was waiting for the main fleet, commanded by his brother, Admiral Richard Howe, to arrive from England. Determined to hold New York, Washington urgently summoned militia from Massachusetts and Connecticut to quickly move to New York. To prepare for the impending British attack, his soldiers piled up sandbags everywhere. Before the reinforcements arrived, Washington was severely short-handed, with fewer than 9,000 soldiers, and 2,000 of them too sick to fight. On July 4th, the Declaration of Independence was approved. Congress printed 200 copies of the broadsheet and distributed them throughout the colonies. On July 6th, Hancock sent a copy of the Declaration to Washington, asking him to read it to the Army. Washington received the broadsheet on July 8th and ordered his troops to gather at 6 p.m. the next evening to hear it read aloud. The soldiers cheered when they heard the document. There was a light gray statue of King George III at Bowling Green, but now that the king's rule was over, the people decided unanimously to take it down. On the night of the 9th, the statue was toppled to the cheers of the crowd and turned into bullets for the cause of independence. On the afternoon of July 12th, with the aid of a strong wind and a powerful tide, 5 British warships, including the 40-gun Phoenix and the 20-gun Rose, along with a brig and 2 supply ships, sailed towards Battery Park. The Phoenix and Rose sailed up the Hudson River, bombarding New York City for a terrifying 2 hours. The British ships' raid on the Hudson cut off communication between New York, Albany, and the lakes. The British Navy's command of the sea gave them great mobility. On July 14th, General Howe and his brother, Lord Howe, discovered that Washington had occupied New York and decided to send Lieutenant Philip Brown to deliver a message proposing peace talks. Brown's ship was intercepted by 3 American vessels between Governor's Island and Staten Island, and their soldiers demanded to know his business. When Brown said he had a letter for Washington, the American officers refused to acknowledge the existence of such a person, declining to accept the letter. Washington felt that as the de facto head of the new nation, his treatment should reflect his legitimate authority. He refused to accept a letter addressed to Miss Not George Washington. Finally, on July 17th, he received a letter addressed to His Excellency General Washington, requesting a meeting with General William Howe's aide-de-camp, Colonel James Patterson. At noon on July 20th, a barge carrying Colonel Patterson arrived at Battery Park. When Patterson placed the original letter from Richard Howe on the table, it still bore the address Mr. George Washington. Washington, sensing that such fickleness in address and the presence of so many warships meant no good faith peace talks, declined the request, citing that he lacked the authority to negotiate a settlement. By the end of July, Washington's soldiers were toiling in the sweltering heat of a drought-stricken city. The conditions were a breeding ground for disease, and dysentery, typhoid, malaria, and smallpox afflicted the troops, rendering 1/3 of them unfit for combat. Washington allowed the regiments to shift more of their diet from meat to fresh vegetables to combat scurvy. The soldiers also lacked uniforms, so Washington suggested they wear hunting shirts, and to make up for the shortage of weapons, General Nathanael Greene distributed 300 spears. All in all, the Continental Army was a ragtag bunch, a mix of old men and boys, many of them African American, mostly poorly dressed. By mid-August, a new British fleet had arrived in New York, forming an expeditionary force of 32,000 men, including 8,000 Hessian mercenaries. The British deployed 70 warships, half of the Royal Navy, aiming for an overwhelming strike against America. As more militia poured into New York, Washington's army swelled to 23,000 men. But many of them were young men dragged out of shops and farms, soon to face a highly professional army. The critical question was whether the enemy would land on Manhattan or Long Island. This uncertainty led Washington to spread out his troops, a strategy that seemed cautious but risked British ships sailing up the East River and cutting off communication between the Continental Army's wings. The next morning, British light infantry and grenadiers began landing at Gravesend Bay on the southwest corner of Long Island. By day's end, 15,000 redcoats had established a solid beachhead, and this main invasion force would soon grow to 22,000 men. However, due to faulty intelligence, Washington believed the British on Long Island numbered around 8,000 to 9,000, thinking the landing was just a diversion from the main attack on Manhattan. When the British halted at Flatbush, 3 miles from the American lines, he was further misled. Washington kept the main force in Manhattan, transferring only 10 regiments to Brooklyn, making the total force there just 6,000 men. On August 23rd, after inspecting the Long Island defenses with General Sullivan, Washington decided to position 3,000 men in the Gowanus Heights south of Brooklyn, a wooded and hilly area running east-west that could block a northward advance. But General Howe believed that if he could seize the Brooklyn Heights and place his artillery there, he could drive Washington out of New York. just as Washington had driven him out of Boston by taking Dorchester Heights. British troops swarmed towards Brooklyn Heights while the British fleet advanced on southern Manhattan. It was only after the British fleet withdrew back through the Narrows that Washington realized the gravity of the situation. The British had devised a clever battle plan to attack the American forces on Long Island from 3 directions. The first, led by Scottish Major General James Grant, would stage a feint along the Gowanus Road on the Brooklyn coast. The second, under Lieutenant General Leopold Philipp von Heister, would lead Hessian troops through Flatbush and then turn north towards central Brooklyn's Gowanus Heights. The most crucial was the third route, a wide flanking maneuver by Generals Howe, Henry Clinton, and Charles Cornwallis through flatlands, bypassing the American troops under Sullivan and Sterling, then moving west through the Jamaica Pass, exploiting a gap in the American defenses. This wide flanking movement would bring them directly to Brooklyn Heights, trapping Sullivan's forces in a deadly pincer. This was a colossal blunder by Washington and his generals. On the night of August 26, General Grant moved along the Gowanus Road towards Manhattan, sending 5 warships up the East River with favorable winds and tides. Luckily, a change in the wind forced the ships to retreat to the harbor. Washington and Joseph Reed crossed the East River in a small boat, joining General Putnam and 4,000 troops defending the fortifications on Brooklyn Heights. As the focus shifted irreversibly from Manhattan, Washington ordered more regiments to cross to Long Island. South of Gowanus Creek, the portly Lord Sterling led 1,600 men in a fierce battle. The Americans fought heroically for 4 hours until overwhelmed by over 7,000 British and Hessian soldiers. In their first combat, Colonel William Smallwood's Maryland 1st Regiment tenaciously held a small hill, ensuring Sterling's forces could escape. Though they saved many retreating Americans, they suffered heavy casualties, with only 144 of 400 soldiers surviving. General Sullivan's 3,500 men tried to block the British advance through the dense woods of the Gowanus Heights. Spread thin along a defensive line stretching miles, they suddenly faced a massive assault by Hessian troops. As Sullivan tried to withdraw, he found his men surrounded by a fierce barrage of gunfire. Thousands of panic-stricken American soldiers, lacking bayonets for defense, could only flee across the blood-soaked plain back to Brooklyn Heights. The ruthless Hessians bayoneted many and nailed some captives to trees. The key to the disaster was the success of the eastern flanking move through Jamaica Pass. The Battle of Long Island resulted in heavy American losses, with 300 killed and 1,000 captured. Strangely, General Howe, fearing high casualties, didn't press his advantage, withdrawing his troops out of artillery range instead. The Howe brothers believed they could now deliver a fatal blow to Washington by positioning warships behind the East River, trapping him between the Royal Navy and the British soldiers. On August 28th, cold rain fell on Brooklyn, soaking the already wet ground. Many American soldiers, without tents, struggled to keep their clothes and ammunition dry. The next day, as the weather grew gloomier and wetter, Washington rode among his troops, now seeing through the fog that the British had advanced overnight, digging trenches just 600 yards from his outer defenses. On the afternoon of August 29th, at 4 o'clock, he called a war council at a house called Four Chimneys on Brooklyn Heights, offering a perfect view of New York Harbor. They unanimously decided to retreat from Brooklyn to Manhattan, taking advantage of a lull in the battle. Washington planned to evacuate all 9,500 American soldiers across the East River overnight, finishing before dawn. He instructed General Heath to gather every type of boat available. After dark, the Continental Army began a silent retreat, with soldiers woken in shifts to maintain quiet. Washington himself stood firm at the dock, directing operations. He kept campfires burning on Brooklyn Heights to conceal the evacuation. So secretive was the plan that only the generals were aware of it. Colonel Edward Hand was ordered to hold the Brooklyn Heights fortifications until the last moment. However, General Mifflin prematurely ordered Hand to the dock, shocking Washington when he encountered them in the dark. Mifflin rode up, and Washington, furious, called Mifflin's order a mistake, stating the retreat wasn't over and ordering Hand back to the Heights. By the morning of August 30th, some American soldiers, including Washington, remained on the Brooklyn shore. Washington vowed to cross on the last boat. Then a thick fog rolled in, cloaking the retreating Americans from British eyes. Soldiers, learning of the retreat, desperately rushed the boats. Washington, enraged, threatened to sink a boat with a large rock to restore order. The British awoke to find, to their shock, that over 9,000 soldiers had crossed the East River. In this nearly flawless operation, not a single American soldier was lost. Although it was a defensive move, it saved the cause of American independence. The fledgling nation was nearly buried on the shores of Brooklyn. After the retreat, soldiers were sick and wounded, with some seeking refuge in tents. Desperate, some began looting houses, infuriating Washington, who condemned the plundering, robbing, and burning of houses, and ordered a search of the soldiers' backpacks. To boost morale, he rode along the East River, publicly inspecting his troops. On September 12th, with the British advancing on the Harlem River, a war council reversed their decision to defend New York. 2 days later, Washington moved his headquarters to an elegant mansion north of Harlem Heights. During the night of September 14 to 15, 5 British warships anchored at Kip's Bay, followed by 84 barges secretly carrying 4,000 British and Hessian soldiers from Newtown Creek on Long Island. At 11 a.m., the warship's cannons turned towards Manhattan, unleashing a terrifying bombardment that obliterated American defenses. British and Hessian soldiers waded ashore with bayonets glinting. Like in the Battle of Brooklyn, the Hessians took no prisoners, overseeing mass executions and shooting dozens of young Americans trying to surrender. One Hessian soldier even decapitated an American prisoner and impaled his head on a pike. These atrocities spread fear among the American troops. When George Washington reached the cornfields of Murray Hill, half a mile from Kip's Bay, his soldiers were in a panic, fleeing in disarray, abandoning muskets, cartridges, tents, and backpacks. Angered by their lack of discipline, he couldn't stop the chaos. General Howe's delay in pursuing allowed Washington to regroup nearly all his troops, safely retreating to Harlem Heights. Washington again appealed to John Hancock for long-term enlistments, citing the frequent turnover, reliance on immature militia, and lack of discipline as major concerns. He stressed that without decent pay, officers and soldiers couldn't perform effectively. Supplies like tents, cooking pots, blankets, and clothing were still severely lacking. Pushed by Washington, Congress agreed to offer $20 and 100 acres of land to anyone who enlisted until the end of the war. On the morning of October 12th, General Howe continued pressing the Continental Army, sending 150 British ships through dense fog along the East River to land 4,000 troops at Throg's Neck, a marshy area on the Westchester Shore, just east of Harlem Heights. Washington had to retreat his troops 18 miles north to the village of White Plains. Along the way, starving soldiers resorted to stealing food from farmers' fields to survive. With no tents or blankets, they relied on piles of autumn leaves for warmth during chilly nights. On the morning of October 28th, Washington sent General Alexander McDougall with 1,600 men to defend Chatterton Hill behind a stone wall. Howe sent 4,000 British and Hessian troops to assault Chatterton Hill. In the first wave, Captain Alexander Hamilton fiercely defended a rocky bluff with 2 field cannons, repelling the enemy. In the second wave, British and Hessian soldiers waded through the Bronx River, bravely ascending the wooded slope under heavy fire. Their artillery set the autumn leaves ablaze, and as they crossed the burning grass, Hessian soldiers held their powder kegs overhead to prevent explosions. Eventually, the enemy overran the Americans, and the militia lost their resolve and fled. Despite this, British and Hessian casualties numbered 276, twice the American losses. However, Howe, being cautious, awaited reinforcements. By the 4th day, Howe discovered Washington had retreated to higher ground with stronger defenses, prompting Howe to withdraw to Dobbs Ferry. 2 outposts on the Hudson River, Fort Washington and Fort Lee, along with river obstacles, aimed to block British ships. On October 9th, Washington witnessed British ships testing American defenses by sending 3 warships up the river. Despite intense American cannon fire from both shores, killing 9 British sailors, the ships passed almost unscathed, undeterred by underwater barriers and a chain across the river. Fort Washington, a massive pentagonal earthwork spanning Manhattan's highest point from today's 181st to 186th Street, had several flaws. Lacking an internal water source, it relied on the Hudson River hundreds of feet below. Built on solid rock, there was little soil for digging trenches and lacked basic facilities like an ammunition depot, palisades, or barracks. Its artillery could only target the Hudson River, leaving it vulnerable to land threats. Most importantly, it could only hold 1,200 men, insufficient to shelter the potential 3,000 troops. Most soldiers had to be stationed outside its defenses, defeating its purpose. On November 5th, 3 British warships again passed the Hudson River fortifications unscathed. 3 days later, Washington wrote to General Nathanael Greene, in charge of the fort, advising abandoning Fort Washington as it couldn't prevent British ships from passing. Greene, seeing the fort as impregnable, dismissed Washington's suggestion to clear out supplies. A deserter named William Demont surrendered to the British on November 2nd, providing Fort Washington's blueprints. Soldiers shivered in the cold, starved, and were disease-ridden. Many soldiers' contracts expired at the end of November, with many heading home. On November 13th, Washington met Greene at Fort Lee's headquarters. Contrary to Washington's advice, Greene reinforced Fort Washington with more troops and supplies. A group of aides led by Joseph Reed urged Washington to countermand these orders. Eventually, Washington agreed with Greene's strategy, leaving Greene in charge of Forts Washington and Lee while he moved to New Jersey. General William Heath guarded the Hudson Highlands with thousands of troops and assigned Charles Lee with 7,000 men to protect the New England route. On November 15th, General Howe committed 13,000 troops to besiege Fort Washington. Learning of the ultimatum in Hackensack, New Jersey, Washington rode to Fort Lee. The next morning, the British launched repeated assaults on the fort. By 1 p.m., nearly all terrified American soldiers were crammed into the small fort, which became a death trap. The enemy then rampaged, bayoneting any American they could find. Washington, standing on the rocky terrain of Fort Lee, watched the tragedy unfold across the river, deeply moved. An hour later, the soldiers at Fort Washington surrendered. By 4 p.m., 2,837 soldiers, including 230 officers, marched out, humiliated by British kicks and punches. These American prisoners were sent to British prison ships in New York Harbor under extremely harsh conditions. It was a complete disaster, but despite Greene's responsibility, Washington didn't expel him from the army. On the morning of November 20th, Washington learned that thousands of enemy soldiers had daringly crossed the Hudson River on a dark, rainy night, just 6 miles from Fort Lee. He ordered an immediate evacuation of 2,000 soldiers, abandoning most of their supplies, 200 cannons, hundreds of tents, and thousands of barrels of flour. The retreating Americans made it across the only bridge before the enemy could destroy it. During the retreat, Washington rode at the dangerous rear, overseeing the bridge's destruction to delay the enemy. Luckily, General Howe again chose to intimidate the rebels rather than destroy them, not pursuing the Americans. After this campaign, the British government awarded Howe the Knight of the Bath, and he became Sir William Howe. However, the British showed Washington that defending heavily fortified coastal areas was pointless, forcing him to move inland, where he was more mobile, and the British, who preferred cities, would be at a disadvantage. Washington and his exhausted troops began a grueling retreat through New Jersey. That day, 2,000 militiamen from New Jersey and Maryland quietly left, leaving him with about 3,800 men in an area full of loyalists. Meanwhile, Lord Howe issued a proclamation offering pardons to those who swore allegiance to the king, and thousands of disheartened Americans took up the offer. Upon arriving in New Jersey, Washington found many residents had chosen to side with the British, abandoning the cause of independence. He had hoped for a heroic stand at Hackensack or New Brunswick, but almost all the residents, either fearful or discontented, refused to fight. With no other options, Washington led his troops across the Delaware River near Trenton, Pennsylvania. He quickly ordered his men to search for and seize or destroy any boats within 60 miles that might fall into British hands. For future use, he hid all sturdy boats in nearby rivers or islands, particularly emphasizing Durham boats, which typically transported iron ore and other goods. These black boats, equipped with 2 masts and sails, could be maneuvered in bad weather with 18-foot oars or poles. The British had reclaimed 3 former colonies: New York, New Jersey, and Rhode Island. Philadelphia was in a panic, with many residents locking their homes and fleeing. On December 13th, Congress abandoned the indefensible city and moved to Baltimore. As the year-end approached, many soldiers' enlistments were expiring, and without a victory soon, morale would plummet, making future recruitment even harder. Washington decided to take bold action, planning a surprise attack on Christmas when the enemy would be least expecting it. With over 7,600 troops now, Washington and his generals decided to cross the Delaware River on Christmas night and attack the Hessians in Trenton while they were celebrating. By mid-December, General Howe believed the American army would soon disband, so he stationed heavy troops at various outposts and retreated to New York, underestimating the American generals once again. On Christmas night in 1776, the Delaware River was filled with floating ice. Washington had his men cross using the previously hidden Durham boats, along with horses and 18 field cannons, nearly 400 tons of heavy artillery. They found a landing spot on the New Jersey shore and prepared to march 9 miles to Trenton by 4 a.m. The route wound through woods with steep, dangerous roads, and a mix of sleet and snow made the march difficult. The soldiers' shoes were in tatters, their frostbitten feet leaving bloody footprints in the snow. Washington split his troops into 2 columns for the march to Trenton, taking the harder route up Pennington Road himself. The Hessians, unaware of the impending danger, were still celebrating. Many British soldiers had already shed their uniforms and weapons, believing they could indulge on the holiday. The Hessian commander, Colonel Rao, was invited to play cards and received a note from a loyalist spy about the advancing Americans while playing. However, he was too engrossed in the game to read it and stuffed it into his pocket, forgetting about it. As Washington approached Trenton, the snowstorm raged on. He planned to surprise the Hessians, hoping to catch them off guard. Emerging from the woods near Trenton around 8 a.m., Washington split his troops into 3 columns, personally leading the central one, advancing at a trot in an exposed position. The Americans achieved victory in under an hour, a triumph with profound historical impact. Hessian casualties included 22 dead, 84 wounded, and nearly 900 captured, compared to just 2 Americans killed in action and another 4 or 5 who died from exposure. The Americans seized large quantities of muskets, bayonets, cannons, and swords. Colonel Rao, neglecting his duty, died under American fire. Given the freezing weather and the instability of his drunken troops, Washington and his officers decided to expedite their return to the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River. While Hessians were typically harsh on prisoners, Washington treated all Hessian captives honorably. In his general orders on December 27th, Washington proportionately distributed the cash value of the spoils among his soldiers and allowed them rum and rest, a belated Christmas gift. On December 27th, Washington held a tactical meeting and decided to attack Trenton again. By December 28th, snow was falling heavily. Washington first ordered the New Jersey militia to harass the enemy's flanks and rear. On December 29th, he led his troops back across the river to Trenton, encamping on a secure slope behind Assunpink Creek at Trenton's southern end. The immediate priority was convincing the soldiers whose enlistments expired on New Year's Day to stay. By bringing them to Trenton, Washington made it harder for them to leave and used all his persuasive powers to keep them. In the end, he convinced over 3,000 soldiers to extend their service by 6 weeks, offering each a $10 bounty. To gauge the enemy's intentions, Washington sent cavalry patrols near Princeton. Several captured British dragoons revealed that General Cornwallis had gathered 8,000 men in Princeton, preparing to attack Washington in Trenton. On the evening of January 2nd, 1777, Washington had Edward Hand's troops set up an outer defensive line between Trenton and Princeton to block the British. When the British came within range, American riflemen opened fire. The Americans hid in the woods, ravines, and even road bends, shooting and retreating, with the British hot on their heels. By 3 p.m., the British reached Stockton Hollow, about half a mile from Trenton. Washington, seeing Cornwallis's vanguard arriving with 5,500 men, positioned his troops on the slopes behind the Assunpink Creek, building defenses on the south bank to form 3 lines. When Hand's troops reached the creek, the Hessians charged them with bayonets, causing chaos among the Americans. Seeing the disorder, Washington rode through the crowd on the bridge, shouting for Hand's rear guard to retreat and regroup under American artillery cover. The British made 3 bold attempts to take the bridge, but were repelled each time by American artillery, leaving many dead. Hundreds of British and Hessian soldiers died in the futile assaults. One soldier remarked, "The bridge was a bloody red, covered with the dead and wounded in their red coats." Cornwallis thought he had Washington trapped between Trenton and the Delaware River, which was wide, deep, and full of ice. So he decided to wait until the next day to attack. But Washington wasn't going to sit and wait. Fearing his troops would be surrounded by superior British forces, he called his generals and decided to quietly retreat at night, bypassing Cornwallis's left flank and heading north on less traveled country roads to confront the British at Princeton. To cover the midnight retreat, they wrapped the wheels of the artillery wagons in cloth to muffle the sound, kept the campfires burning to create the illusion of an overnight stay, and made loud noises with digging tools. The troops were once again kept in the dark about their destination. After a 12-mile night march to Princeton, they arrived at dawn. The soldiers quickly repaired a bridge over Stony Creek south of the town, then split into 2 groups. Sullivan's troops moved northeast, and Greene's moved due north. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood was preparing to march 2 British regiments to support Cornwallis at Trenton when he encountered General Hugh Mercer's American troops on a wide rolling field. Mawhood ordered a fierce bayonet charge, shocking Mercer's men. Mercer himself was knocked off his horse, beaten badly on the ground, and killed, mistaken for Washington. As Mercer's men began to retreat under the British bayonets, General Greene's Pennsylvania militia joined the fight, but collided with Mercer's fleeing troops, causing panic. Just then, Washington appeared and rallied the soldiers, shouting, "Parade with us, my brave fellows! There are but a handful of the enemy, and we shall have them directly." Washington ordered his men not to fire until commanded. Showing remarkable calm, he rode along the line. He then led a charge up the hill, stopping when they were 30 yards from the enemy. At his order, the Americans fired, and the enemy returned fire. Miraculously unharmed, Washington sat on his horse, surrounded by smoke. He then pursued the retreating enemy, having already left the main action. The victorious Americans inflicted over 500 casualties on the British and captured 200 to 300 prisoners. Only about 36 Americans were killed in this lopsided battle. Cornwallis, upon discovering the American ruse, rushed to Princeton to find it empty. The consecutive victories at Trenton and Princeton lifted American spirits, especially since the Continental Army had decisively beaten the British regulars. These victories cemented Washington's status as a legendary figure. After the Battle of Princeton, Cornwallis abandoned Trenton, Bordentown, and Princeton, withdrawing all British troops. Washington, deeming further attacks too risky, led his exhausted and reduced army to winter quarters in Morristown, New Jersey. This location allowed him to harass British supply lines and drive the enemy out of many parts of New Jersey, despite Howe's army being 2 to 3 times larger. Morristown, 25 miles west of New York City, was surrounded by protective hills and had abundant farms to feed the hungry army, providing a comfortable winter haven. In July 1777, British General John Burgoyne led his troops south from Quebec through Lake Champlain, recapturing Fort Ticonderoga, intending to meet up with Howe to split New England and control the Hudson River. The American garrison surrendered without a fight in this disgraceful defeat. Howe chose not to head north to join Burgoyne, but planned to land at Elk Head in the northern bay to attack Philadelphia, the capital. On August 24, 1777, George Washington led his 12,000 troops along Front Street and Chestnut Street, parading through Philadelphia on a white horse. As Howe advanced on Philadelphia, Washington decided to intercept him at Brandywine Creek, a natural defensive line southwest of Philadelphia with steep ravines and forested hills. Washington concentrated his forces on the high ground behind Chad's Ford on the creek's eastern bank, where major roads crossed. On the night of September 10th, a spy informed Howe of 2 more fords farther north, creating a vulnerable point in the American line. Howe decided to lead 8,200 men with Cornwallis in a bold, secret flanking maneuver to the north, crossing the newly discovered fords and then circling south to hit Washington's right flank from behind. Meanwhile, Baron Wilhelm von Knyphausen's 5,000-man vanguard would attack Chad's Ford directly, distracting the Americans and making them believe it was the main assault. Before dawn on September 11th, Howe launched his plan. Knyphausen's troops clashed with the American main force at Chad's Ford as scheduled. Washington moved Adam Stevens and Lord Stirling's troops to Birmingham Hill to strengthen General Sullivan's line, a position well suited to repel any sudden flank attack from upstream. Major Joseph Spear reported to Sullivan that he saw nothing on Great Valley Road. Around noon, under heavy fog, Howe's troops and horses forded Jeffress's Ford to the north, unbeknownst to Washington. By 1:15 p.m., Washington received reports of 2 British brigades approaching Birmingham Hill from the north, realizing Howe had outmaneuvered him. He rushed to Birmingham Hill, but didn't fully grasp that these brigades were only the vanguard of Howe's larger force. By 4 p.m., British and German troops advanced in 3 clear columns, ignoring American grapeshot and canister fire. They tore through the American lines, launching deadly attacks with alternating volleys and bayonet charges. The ground was littered with bodies, mostly American. Some Patriot units turned and fled. To complete the encirclement, Knyphausen's troops crossed Brandywine Creek and launched fierce bayonet attacks on the Americans, turning the creek red with blood. The outnumbered Americans fled east toward Chester in a chaotic retreat. The battlefield refugees trickled into the American camp all night, leaving behind hundreds of bleeding comrades. Howe requested Washington send doctors to tend to the wounded. Overall, the Americans lost about 200 dead, 500 wounded, and 400 captured, while the victorious British suffered only 90 dead and 500 wounded. This forced the Continental Army to retreat to Chester, Pennsylvania. Fighting near his hometown, Washington should have known the terrain better instead of relying on rough maps and errant scouts. The slaughter and chaos at Brandywine only reinforced perceptions of Washington's indecisiveness. After the defeat at Brandywine, Washington led his battered army north across the Schuylkill River to Pennypack Mill. He could no longer guarantee the safety of the American capital. He urgently dispatched Alexander Hamilton and Henry Lee to burn the flour mills on the Schuylkill to prevent them from falling into British hands. On the night of September 18th, Hamilton alerted Hancock that British troops might enter the city before dawn, causing congressmen to flee in a panic. Washington used his emergency powers and sent Hamilton into the city with 100 men to requisition supplies. Many soldiers had lost their blankets and clothing, and 1,000 were barefoot. As the weather got colder, these items topped Hamilton's list. In 2 days of frantic activity, Hamilton demanded these goods from the residents, issuing receipts in the hope that they might be reimbursed someday. This efficient action provided each soldier with 40 rounds of ammunition. On the night of September 20th to 21st, British infantry stealthily moved through the woods near Paoli, where General Anthony Wayne's troops were resting. The sleeping American troops were caught completely off guard as the British silently approached. At first, the British soldiers covered the Americans' mouths and stabbed them with bayonets. It was successful until one American woke up and shouted for the others to run. The Americans scattered in confusion, only to find themselves surrounded by British troops who killed or wounded 300 of them with their bayonets. On September 26th, the British achieved a propaganda victory by taking control of the American capital and major city. Cornwallis led a force of British and Hessian troops into Philadelphia, while General Howe kept his main force just 6 miles northwest of the city in the village of Germantown, near the Schuylkill River. Eager for a victory, Washington, with 8,000 Continental Army soldiers and 3,000 militiamen, decided to launch a surprise attack on Howe's 9,000 troops. When he learned that Howe had sent 2 regiments to attack a small American fort in Delaware, Washington became even more determined. Howe had wisely chosen a camp in Germantown, crisscrossed with creeks, ravines, and gullies. The main street, Germantown Road, ran through the town for 2 miles, lined with stone houses protected by fences and hedges, which could slow down any American advance. Washington devised a complex plan for a nighttime march. On the night of October 3rd, four widely separated but roughly parallel columns would begin moving southeast and converge on Germantown before dawn. Washington and General Sullivan would lead a column of 3,000 men charging straight down Germantown Road. To the northeast, Greene would lead 5,000 men down parallel Limekiln Road, while further north, General William Smallwood and another 1,000 militiamen would follow an Indian path called Old York Road. To the south, General John Armstrong would lead 2,000 Pennsylvania militiamen along the Schuylkill River. If everything went as planned, Washington's central column would catch the British off guard, while Greene's column would swing around and trap them against the Schuylkill River. Because the Continental Army lacked a standard uniform, a New Jersey unit even wore captured British red coats. Washington ordered his men to put shiny white paper in their hats to avoid friendly fire. The 15-mile nighttime march was made even more challenging by thick fog, which cut off communication between the columns. The fighting began with fierce gunfire at a place called Mount Airy, where General Anthony Wayne's men advanced along a lane leading to the town's entrance. They encountered a regiment led by Colonel Musgrave. In the fog, both sides fired at each other, causing heavy casualties, and eventually the British troops retreated. When Washington reached the outskirts of Germantown, he saw a strange sight. Musgrave had set fire to the buckwheat fields, mixing smoke with the fog, limiting visibility to 30 yards. Musgrave and his men took refuge in a mansion. As Washington and his troops advanced along Germantown Road, they were stunned by a barrage of bullets. Through the fog, they saw that the fire came from a 3-story mansion owned by Benjamin Chew, occupied by 100 British soldiers. This stone house, located on high ground, had been turned into an impregnable fortress by the British. They barricaded the doors and windows and aimed their weapons at the Americans. Following Washington's orders, Lieutenant Colonel William Smith approached the house with a white flag, demanding their surrender, but the British shot him dead. Washington then ordered 3 regiments to storm the fortified house. Knox positioned 4 cannons to shell the house from an angle, but the stone walls held. The Americans decided to set the house on fire and launch an assault. Realizing their intentions, Musgrave and his men fought fiercely, shooting at the Americans emerging from the fog. Small groups of Americans charged the house but were repelled by British gunfire, leaving at least 57 American soldiers dead. The prolonged attack on Chew's house delayed part of Washington's column by half an hour, giving Howe's troops time to regroup. Eventually, Washington ordered his men to move on, leaving a detachment behind to prevent the British from pursuing them. Shrouded in fog and smoke, the other American columns mistook the gunfire for a British attack and began firing on each other, triggering a full retreat. Washington ordered Major Benjamin Tallmadge to block the fleeing infantry with a line of horses, but the soldiers either went around or desperately climbed over the horses. Washington shouted at his men to stand and fight, but to no avail. Meanwhile, Greene's troops to the north also retreated in confusion. The battle lasted less than 3 hours. By 9 p.m., the American forces regrouped 20 miles away at Pennypack Mill. The final toll, 150 Americans dead, 520 wounded, and 400 captured, compared to 70 British dead, 450 wounded, and 15 captured. Washington was deeply disappointed, having seen his troops inexplicably retreat when victory was within reach. The underlying issue was the lack of resolve among the untrained recruits. In early August, following the defeat at Ticonderoga, Congress chose Horatio Gates as the new leader of the Northern Army. Washington, concerned about Burgoyne's advance south from Canada, sent Daniel Morgan and 500 sharpshooters to join Gates. In October, General Horatio Gates decisively defeated General John Burgoyne at Saratoga, capturing 5,000 of his soldiers. This victory significantly undermined British confidence and prompted a re-evaluation of the costly war in North America. Gates's success contrasted sharply with Washington's defeats. While Washington yearned for a victory, his rival achieved a stunning triumph, fueling Gates's aspirations for equal and an independent command, answerable only to Congress. Gates's coarse manners and egalitarian instincts appealed to New Englanders, and his ambitions grew with his success. The Saratoga victory also attracted France to join the American cause. Washington believed that the Middle Atlantic states were full of loyalists, while thousands of New York militiamen constantly harassed Burgoyne, causing his troops to struggle in the Hudson Valley. Howe also failed to join forces with Burgoyne. In late November, Horatio Gates was appointed chairman of the Board of War, retaining his rank as Major General and gaining oversight of Washington. Gates, Conway, and Mifflin began efforts to undermine and even remove Washington, an episode known as the Conway Cabal. However, Washington had become a symbolic figure representing the army, the primary unifying force in the war, which is why his failures were tolerated and his mistakes overlooked. In December 1777, General William Howe settled comfortably into winter quarters in Philadelphia. For 18th century British officers, war was still a seasonal affair, and they saw no need for undue sacrifice in the cold winds. But George Washington wasn't so lucky. He had to figure out how to shelter his ragged army, with 4,000 men lacking even a single blanket. Washington led his army to Valley Forge. This windswept, desolate plateau, 20 miles northwest of Philadelphia, offered open fields and forests, and was safely out of reach of Howe's army, being a day's march away. The high ground provided an excellent defensive position. The nearby woods offered plenty of fuel and building material. The local agriculture could feed his troops, and the nearby Schuylkill River and Valley Creek would provide fresh water. Some legislators criticized Washington for taking his army into a comfortable winter camp, but an angry Washington retorted that it was much more comfortable to write criticisms from a warm room by the fireplace than it was to be out in the snow without a blanket. Washington slept in an upstairs room of a compact, two-story stone mill house named for its blacksmith shop. He worked in a simple room downstairs with a fireplace. Many aides crowded onto the floor downstairs to sleep. To provide additional space, Washington added an adjacent log hut for dining. Washington knew his top priority was to build warm, dry huts. He ordered the soldiers to build little huts themselves, dividing into squads of 12 to cut timber, with each squad building a hut to live in. To boost morale, Washington offered $12 to the first squad to finish a hut and $100 to anyone who could invent a cheap substitute for planks. Each hut measured 14 by 16 feet with a 6.5-foot height and housed 12 men in dark and suffocating conditions. Nearby dead horses and their entrails rotted everywhere, emitting a stench in the winter air. The soldiers ate a coarse food made of flour and water, baked on hot stones. Some desperate soldiers tore canvas strips from tents to cobble together crude shirts or shoes. Nearly 3,000 men were unfit for duty due to lack of shoes. Washington wrote, "One of those attending my person and table is indecently and most shamefully naked." Washington's ability to inspire at Valley Forge came in part from his steady presence, demonstrating leadership in ways hard to articulate and even harder to replicate in later times. That the Continental Army didn't dissolve or mutiny on a large scale at Valley Forge is astonishing, showing the faith Washington built among his men, even in desperate conditions. One of the most terrifying aspects of Valley Forge was rampant disease, which could kill 30% of the soldiers at any time. By winter's end, 2,000 men had died, mostly from disease. Washington was disheartened by the selfish behavior of the citizens, who he hadn't expected would rather sell their produce to the British soldiers in Philadelphia than to the freezing American soldiers. As continental currency depreciated and inflation soared, prices skyrocketed. Patriots with depreciated currency couldn't compete with British pounds. In January 1778, Brigadier General James Mitchell Varnum of Rhode Island proposed an unimaginable idea to Washington: to increase his state's troops by enlisting black soldiers. Washington knew this was a radical idea. However, desperately needing more manpower, he approved the plan. And the state promised freedom to any slave willing to join an all-black regiment. Massachusetts followed Rhode Island in recruiting black soldiers, while Connecticut allowed slave owners to avoid service by sending slaves in their place. By August of that year, 755 black men served in the Continental Army, making up nearly 5% of its force. On February 6th, Benjamin Franklin achieved a major diplomatic success in Paris. France signed 2 treaties recognizing American independence and pledging to assist America. The first sacrifice brought by the French alliance was General William Howe, replaced by General Henry Clinton. French involvement necessitated a significant shift in British strategy. Both nations controlled profitable West Indian islands, whose vast sugar and cotton plantations, worked by slaves, yielded substantial profits. When Clinton was ordered to send 8,000 men to reinforce the West Indies and Florida that spring, he decided holding Philadelphia was untenable and opted to withdraw his troops to New York via New Jersey. On June 18th, 10,000 British and Hessian soldiers began their march across New Jersey toward New York, slowed by a baggage train of 1,500 wagons stretching 12 miles long. Washington, getting wind of this, sent 6 brigades in pursuit. This time, the Continental Army had 12,000 men, enjoying a numerical advantage. The British troops turned east toward Sandy Hook, moving through rocky and uncertain terrain at a pace of only 6 miles a day. Washington appointed Charles Lee to launch a fierce attack on the British left flank near Monmouth Courthouse, now Freehold, on June 28th, leading an advance guard of 5,000 men. He himself stayed back with 6,000 men, ready to follow up and press forward with the main force. Instead, Lee only launched a feint, leading to confusion as the approaching British forces tried to wedge themselves between the American troops. Lee then oddly ordered a contingent of the American left flank to retreat, and other units, seeing this unexpected action, also fell back, thinking a general retreat was underway. When Washington arrived, he found the Continental Army in a chaotic retreat, and Lee following, his dog trailing behind, causing Washington to turn pale with rage. Not one to use coarse language often, Washington cursed Lee furiously. Lee thought he had achieved a great feat by saving his outmatched troops with an organized retreat. Charles Lee had been captured the previous year near a British camp while visiting a brothel and held prisoner for 16 months. This eccentric man wrote to Washington during his captivity, requesting his beloved dogs be sent to him, because I never needed their company more. The British tried to win over the mercurial Lee with fine food, wine, and a warm bed. He was released in April, and Washington restored him to his rank as second in command. Boudinot noted, Lee brought a filthy woman from Philadelphia, smuggling her in through the back door to share his bed. Washington had no time for this nonsense. He demoted Lee to the rear, turned, and halted the army's retreat, reorganizing the lines. His calm demeanor inspired his soldiers to resist the advancing British bayonets and cavalry. American artillery pounded the British from nearby ridges. The bloody battle raged all afternoon in a fierce back-and-forth struggle with heavy casualties on both sides. British and Continental forces exchanged cannon fire for 2 hours. At one point, while deep in conversation with an officer, a cannonball exploded at his horse's feet, spraying dirt in his face. Washington continued the conversation as if nothing had happened. He rode back and forth, organizing defenses and encouraging his troops. The battle lasted until 6 p.m., with Washington planning to launch flanking attacks on the British the next morning. But Clinton slipped away under cover of darkness, abandoning his wounded and retreating, joining forces with Knyphausen on Middletown Heights by dawn. In this conflict, both sides suffered roughly equal losses. 362 Americans were killed, wounded, or missing, compared to 380 to 500 British casualties. The Battle of Monmouth enhanced Washington's reputation, marking him as a leader who could turn the tide. His performance at Monmouth stood out, as it was the last major battle in the North. From then on, British High Command shifted its focus to the south. On July 8, 1778, a French fleet anchored in Delaware Bay, consisting of 12 massive ships of the line and 4 frigates, carrying 4,000 soldiers. The French expected Washington's army to be twice its actual size, while Washington had hoped for more than 4,000 French troops. That fall, rumors circulated that the British might evacuate New York, but despite a large fleet sailing south in November, Sir Henry Clinton remained in the city. Due to hoarding and price manipulation, mismanaged currency had lost 90% of its value in recent months, depriving his soldiers of desperately needed supplies. Continental currency now had a purchasing power of just 3 cents, leading Congress to halt printing money and call on states to finance the army themselves. States issued their own paper money, further driving up prices. soldiers weren't taken care of because the nation responsible for them didn't yet exist. The colonies, a confederation of 13 states, each fielded their own troops, but they were rife with jealousy and suspicion, agreeing only that giving the army too much power was bad. In late December 1778, after the British scored a decisive victory in Savannah, Georgia, Washington's 24-year-old aide, John Laurens, proposed a bold plan to recruit 3,000 slaves from South Carolina and Georgia into a black regiment that would be granted freedom after the war. By March, with a significant influx of black soldiers from New England, the Continental Army had become a highly integrated force. In the spring of 1780, Sir Henry Clinton and Lord Cornwallis led a massive fleet from New York to lay siege to Charleston, South Carolina. Washington couldn't come to their rescue because Congress and the Board of War had stripped him of control over the Southern Department. On May 12, 1780, Charleston surrendered to the British, with 2,571 Continental soldiers, 343 cannons, and nearly 6,000 muskets falling into enemy hands. In the 18th century, defeated troops were usually allowed to surrender with dignity, marching out proudly with their flags flying. To humiliate the Americans, the British denied them this honor, forcing them to lay down their arms in silence. The defeated soldiers faced the unpleasant choice of becoming prisoners of war or returning home and solemnly swearing not to fight again, resuming their status as loyal British subjects. Clinton, leaving most of his forces with Cornwallis to intimidate the South, returned to New York. After the British captured Charleston, General Gates was appointed commander of the Southern Army. Gates deployed nearly 4,000 troops, significantly outnumbering Cornwallis's forces, but many of them were inexperienced militiamen. The British dealt Gates a crushing blow near Camden, South Carolina, on August 16th. The British forces broke through the American lines, causing the soldiers to flee in terror. This disaster brought Gates down from his high position, especially after he fled 180 miles on horseback in panic before calming down to report to Congress. After the Battle of Camden, Congress relieved Gates of his command, solidifying Washington's undisputed supremacy. This also means he can head south to attack the enemy forces. On August 16, 1781, Washington received crucial intelligence from his officers. Cornwallis had retreated to the eastern end of the Virginia Peninsula, frantically digging trenches and building fortifications in Yorktown. Because of the narrow land strip, he risked being cut off. The enemy could easily land a force on the York and James rivers, build a few small forts, and force them to surrender on their terms. So Washington decided to head south and join the French army to attack Yorktown. He used deception to make the enemy believe that New York was still his target. He set up a tent city on the west bank of the Hudson River, with wagons coming and going, as if preparing for an amphibious assault. To deceive the enemy, Washington also had to deceive his own soldiers, who believed they were headed to Staten Island, fearing spies among them. In reality, they marched inland, through Trenton, then met the French army at Princeton. To avoid revealing his intentions while crossing New Jersey, Washington devised a clever strategy. He split his army into 3 parallel columns, marching at staggered times. The soldiers didn't know their true destination until they reached Trenton, where heavy artillery was loaded onto boats, ready to be transported down the Delaware River to Christiana, Delaware. From there, they needed to march 12 miles to Elkton, Maryland, at the head of the Chesapeake Bay. French Admiral de Grasse had set sail from Santo Domingo with up to 29 warships and 3,200 soldiers. His fleet was to arrive in the Chesapeake Bay by September 3rd, and he needed to leave Virginia by November 1st, returning to the Caribbean, leaving only a few weeks to jointly combat Cornwallis. On September 18th, Washington, de Grasse, and French General Rochambeau met for a conference. On September 28th, Washington and his army began the 12-mile march to Yorktown. Cornwallis and his troops were trapped on the cliffs of Yorktown Village, above the wide and gleaming waters of the York River, with Gloucester Point on the opposite side. Most British soldiers stayed behind the main fortifications, but Cornwallis extended the defenses with 10 low redoubts jutting into the sandy battlefield. From the start, it was an unequal fight. with Cornwallis having fewer than 9,000 troops against nearly 19,000 Franco-American forces. Cornwallis hoped Sir Henry Clinton would keep his promise to send thousands of reinforcements, but Clinton failed to act in time. On October 1st, Washington and Rochambeau surveyed the terrain for parallel trenches that would gradually approach the enemy. They decided on a European-style siege. 2 British deserters floated to the Allied camp, telling horror stories of widespread disease among Cornwallis's troops. 2,000 were already in the hospital. On the night of October 5th, the Franco-American forces began digging a 2-mile trench in darkness and secrecy. By the next morning, they had piled enough earth to form protective barriers, allowing them to work safely from British fire. The British continuously fired at the Allied positions, making movement extremely dangerous. They threw everything at the Allies: dense rifle fire, grape shot, shells, and bombs. Washington showed extraordinary calm, undeterred by the barrage. Standard siege tactics progressed slowly and methodically, each trench closer to the enemy. On October 12th, the second parallel trench began at only 300 yards from the British positions, with sappers and miners working tirelessly at night, despite deadly and noisy British fire the next day. As the second parallel neared completion, the priority became capturing 2 British outer fortifications, redoubts 9 and 10, which blocked further advances. The French and Americans each took responsibility for 1. Artillery pounded the redoubts to weaken their defenses. At nightfall, as cannon fire lit the sky, Hamilton and his men leaped from their trenches, charging across open ground. To ensure speed and surprise, they were ordered not to fire, using only fixed bayonets. When they reached the redoubts, sappers had to leap into the ditch and face a defensive barrier of sharpened trees, hacking a path with axes. The French attack on Redoubt 9 suffered heavy losses, while Hamilton's group had fewer casualties. Capturing these redoubts allowed the Allies to install short-range howitzers, whose shells could bounce along the ground toward targets, killing with terrifying efficiency. Over 100 Allied cannons pounded the town with relentless fury, making Cornwallis's situation appear hopeless. On the morning of October 17th, at 10 a.m., a British officer appeared before the walls with a white flag, bringing Cornwallis's letter of surrender. 2 days later, surrender terms were signed, with French and American troops lining up on either side of a half-mile road. French soldiers, wearing ornate swords and polished boots, contrasted with many American soldiers who were nearly barefoot. Thousands of defeated British and Hessian soldiers marched heavily through the Allied lines to the beat of drums, their flags tightly furled. Cornwallis, deeming the ceremony beneath his dignity, feigned illness and sent substitutes. The victory at Yorktown captured over 8,000 soldiers who would become ordinary prisoners, while their officers could return to Europe, New York, or any other British-controlled port. After Cornwallis's surrender, no one in Britain, except the king, wanted to continue the war in America. A preliminary peace treaty was signed in Paris on November 30th, 1782, granting America all its desires, including recognition of independence and vast borders extending north to the Great Lakes and west to the Mississippi River. British General Alexander Leslie and his troops withdrew from Charleston, South Carolina, just hours before Nathanael Greene entered the city, ending the Southern War. This positive outcome vindicated Washington's early trust in Greene, despite Greene's mistake at Fort Washington. On April 18, 1783, Washington announced the cessation of hostilities between America and Britain and ordered his quartermaster general to collect discharge certificates to start sending soldiers home. To honor his soldiers, Washington personally signed thousands of these documents. On the cold morning of November 25th, British ships in the harbor delayed their departure. In one last spiteful act, the British greased the flagpole at Fort George in Lower Manhattan, delaying the raising of the American flag. Then, cannons fired 13 times, and Washington, on his gray horse, led his troops into the city along the Boston Post Road. After 8 long years of war, Washington decided to step down. Around noon on December 23rd, he arrived at the State House and took his seat at the podium. The audience was sparse, with only about 20 legislators present. Then the doors opened, and Maryland's top politicians and town gentlemen flooded into the hall, filling the seats below, while bright-eyed women packed the gallery. The room fell silent as Washington, with a hoarse and trembling voice, gripped his speech and said, "Having now finished the work assigned me, I retire from the great theater of action, and bidding an affectionate farewell to this august body under whose orders I have so long acted, I here offer my commission and take my leave of all the employments of public life." Tears began to flow. Finally, Washington shook hands with each member of Congress, bringing his long military career to a close. Before the speech, he had packed his bags and left George Mann's tavern, with his horse and aides waiting outside the State House for a quick departure. He mounted his horse and quietly rode away. McHenry observed, "The spectators wept aloud, and there were few members of Congress who did not shed tears." Finally alone with his aides and servant, Washington rode toward Mount Vernon. Although Washington's military record was mixed, with more losses than victories, his achievements couldn't be measured by battles alone. His persistence in the face of setbacks and his ability to maintain the Army's cohesion over 8.5 years was a monumental feat. More than 200,000 Americans served in the war, with over 20,000 casualties in a country with a population of just over 2 million. Mount Vernon had suffered greatly during the war, and Washington's finances were visibly deteriorating. He had significant debts in Virginia, compounded by depreciating currency. The personal losses incurred during his absence had ballooned to 10,000 pounds. The influx of uninvited visitors, attracted by his fame, strained his resources, as George and Martha Washington were a sociable couple, leading to hefty entertaining expenses. By 1786, he had only 86 pounds in cash. To alleviate his debt, he put 32,373 acres of land in the Ohio region up for sale and even borrowed 500 pounds at 6% interest. During his time in Virginia, he focused on improving agricultural efficiency, adopting advanced methods, and growing 60 different crops. America had no president, only a powerless Congress. Due to Congress's inefficiency, the government couldn't repay the war creditors, and the issued paper money was now worth a fraction of its face value. Without independent revenue sources, Congress could only request funds from states without the power to enforce payment. Meanwhile, the country was becoming increasingly unmanageable and extravagant. Congress could pass laws but couldn't enforce them, request donations but couldn't compel them, and ask for soldiers but couldn't conscript them. The 13 states were disunited, constantly bickering and scheming. For instance, a New Jersey farmer selling potatoes in New York had to pay a 10-cent tax before selling them, and vice versa for a New York merchant selling clothes in New Jersey. This disunity prevented the U.S. from becoming a large market, negotiating trade treaties, or making favorable deals with other nations. Washington, driven by a strong sense of public duty, remained politically engaged after returning to Mount Vernon. In September 1786, James Madison attended a convention in Annapolis, where commissioners from 5 states discussed resolving national trade disputes. The Annapolis Convention concluded that the only solution was a thorough revision of the Articles of Confederation. In the fall of 1786, heavy land taxes in western Massachusetts sparked fury among farmers, many of whom were war veterans. Armed with pitchforks, they stormed rural courts and threatened judges. Their attempt to seize the Springfield Armory was thwarted, deeply concerning Washington, who feared civil war and renewed conflict. Many urged him to return to public life. Eventually, the Virginia legislature appointed him as head of the 7-member delegation to the upcoming Philadelphia Convention, known as the Constitutional Convention, to reform the Articles of Confederation. On Sunday, May 13, 1787, Washington arrived in Chester, Pennsylvania, and was escorted into Philadelphia by a procession of dignitaries and light horsemen. Unanimously elected as the convention's president, Washington remained silent during proceedings, avoiding public opinions or speeches to bridge divides, limiting lobbying to social interactions. He tacitly supported the proceedings, allowing others to shape the new order. The basic structure of the government, with a separation of powers and a bicameral legislature, proposed by Jay and Madison, gained widespread support. Slavery was the most contentious issue at the convention. The abolitionist movement had made significant strides in New England, but lost momentum in the South. Slave owners secured substantial concessions, including counting 3/5 of the slave population for representation in the House and the Electoral College. This was significant for Virginia, where slaves made up 40% of the population, and South Carolina, where they made up 60%. The slave trade would also remain untouched for at least 20 years. Washington chose not to speak publicly at the convention, believing that slavery's abolition was a future issue. After 9 months, 11 states agreed to ratify the Constitution. Its narrow approval in Virginia hinted at Washington's potential presidency. As the war's commander-in-chief, his selfless patriotism and leadership in securing American independence made him the undisputed national father figure. Moreover, his lack of heirs meant no hereditary succession, solidifying his status as the father of the country. Gouverneur Morris once told Washington, "You will become the father of more than 3 million children." Public support for Washington as president was overwhelming. On February 4, 1789, all 69 electors voted for the 57-year-old Washington, making him the only president in U.S. history unanimously elected. President Washington left Mount Vernon for his new residence in New York, the temporary presidential mansion at 3 Cherry Street. The journey was marked by crowds of well-wishers who warmly greeted him. Women waved handkerchiefs, showered him with flowers, and shed tears of joy and congratulations. The entire city celebrated his triumphant arrival. The Constitution required Washington to take the presidential oath of office. So, on April 30, 1789, a cavalry unit and carriages carrying legislators stopped in front of Washington's Cherry Street residence. President-elect Washington got into his carriage, followed by foreign diplomats and cheering citizens. When he got out, he walked through 2 rows of soldiers into the building and ascended to the Senate chamber, where members of Congress awaited him eagerly. When he stepped onto the balcony, the crowd packed into Wall Street and Broadway erupted in spontaneous cheers, with every rooftop crowded with people. That morning, a committee decided to add solemnity to the ceremony by having Washington place his hand on a Bible during the oath, so they hurried to find one. After he took the oath, he bent down, grasped the Bible, and kissed it. Following the ceremony on the balcony, Washington returned to the Senate chamber to deliver his inaugural address. Nervous, he turned the pages with a trembling right hand. The day ended with celebrations throughout New York, bathed in festive lights. Washington's journey from a young colonel to commander-in-chief of the Continental Army to the first president of the United States felt like a dream. After the new government was established, Washington inherited 4 departments from the Confederation Congress: Foreign Affairs, War, Post Office, and Treasury. These departments were part of the executive branch, reporting both to Congress and to Washington. During his presidency, Washington relied on younger men. Jefferson, 10 years his junior, was appointed Secretary of State. Hamilton, more than 20 years younger, was appointed Secretary of the Treasury, and Knox was appointed Secretary of War. Though Jefferson, an idealist, would later have political differences with Washington and Hamilton, they were among Washington's most talented aides and valuable members of his cabinet. During Washington's presidency, North Carolina and Rhode Island had not yet ratified the Constitution due to the absence of a Bill of Rights. In response, Madison drafted amendments. In September 1789, Congress approved these amendments and instructed Washington to send copies to the governors of the 11 states and the executives of North Carolina and Rhode Island. Although these amendments weren't ratified until December 15, 1791, North Carolina joined the Union in November 1789, and Rhode Island followed in May 1790, completing the reunification of the original 13 states. Washington believed measures were needed to improve the government's credit. He endorsed Hamilton's financial plan and funding bill, which were necessary for the nation's economic development. Hamilton proposed gradually repaying the debt through a structured system rather than paying it off immediately. This plan aimed to restore the country's financial health by establishing new tax and loan mechanisms. However, some aspects were controversial, such as redeeming war bonds at face value, which many veterans had sold at a low price, and the federal government assuming state debts, which would enhance central authority. James Madison argued that this plan would raise bond prices, disadvantaging original debt holders, and wealthy states like Virginia, which had paid off most of their debt, would subsidize more extravagant states. Washington remained cautious, not publicly supporting or opposing either side, but tacitly approving Hamilton's proposals. He asked Hamilton to prepare a report highlighting the benefits of the plan to persuade everyone. On December 14, 1790, Alexander Hamilton released a groundbreaking national document advocating for the establishment of the first central bank in U.S. history, with a capital of $10 million, merging public and private ownership, with the government holding 20% and private investors 80%. The northern states almost unanimously supported the bank, while most southern states opposed it. Washington, knowing from the Revolutionary War the importance of national credit, realized that despite Britain's debt, their high credit allowed them to wage war. He also recognized Hamilton's legal acumen and gave him a week to write a detailed rebuttal to the opposition. The bill passed the House on February 8th with a vote of 39 to 20. Disagreements like these became more frequent, even over the location of the capital. Washington eventually endorsed Madison's proposal to establish the federal government on the banks of the Potomac River, which later became Washington, D.C. Before Washington, D.C. was built, Philadelphia was designated as the temporary capital for 10 years. Washington brought 7 of his slaves to the president's house. Under Pennsylvania law from 1780, any adult slave would automatically gain freedom after living in Philadelphia for 6 months. But Washington intended to bypass this law. He made sure that if a slave was taken out of Pennsylvania and brought back, the 6-month clock would reset, preventing them from claiming freedom. To keep his adult slaves enslaved, Washington used various tricks to ensure they didn't understand why they were being sent back home temporarily. He bluntly stated, "I wish to accomplish this under pretext that may deceive both them and the public." As a plantation owner, Washington respected slave marriages and wouldn't sell slaves with families, separating them. In February 1786, he counted his farm's slaves and found that the number of slave children was rising quickly, nearly half the total slave population. These children couldn't perform adult labor, leading to a labor surplus. Washington also saw slavery as an inefficient system because it lacked economic incentives to improve performance, causing slaves to work sluggishly and requiring constant supervision. Therefore, Washington was a tough boss, focused on extracting maximum labor from his slaves. In 1785, he had a cold interaction with a slave whose arm was in a sling. Washington couldn't understand why the man couldn't work. He grabbed a rake with one hand, demonstrating how to rake single-handedly, saying, "If you can eat with your hand, why can't you work with it?" When temperatures dropped to 10 degrees, his workers spent over a week extracting ice from a frozen river and storing it in an ice house, even making women pull stumps from icy swamps. In his will, Washington stipulated the freedom of 123 slaves after his death, making him one of the few large slave owners in Virginia during the Revolutionary era to do so. Differing opinions eventually formed distinct political parties, and by 1792, Washington's cabinet had split into factions. Madison and Jefferson led the Republicans, while Washington and Hamilton led the Federalists, constantly clashing. Washington and Hamilton were committed to a strong federal government, while Jefferson and Madison feared centralized power. Although Washington initially planned to resign after his first term, many Americans couldn't imagine anyone else as president and assumed he would stay indefinitely. Amid growing political tension, the public feared Washington might only serve one term. Only Washington's prestige could maintain stability, and both Jefferson and Hamilton wanted him to stay. Eventually, Washington agreed to a second term and was reelected unanimously with 132 electoral votes. Before the election, he worried about winning by a slim margin, which would have been embarrassing. During his second term, the most challenging issue was the 1791 excise tax on whiskey, which sparked farmers' resistance, reminiscent of pre-revolutionary British taxation. The whiskey tax was a key part of Hamilton's plan to reduce federal deficits. Farmers in western Pennsylvania were furious about government inspectors who had the authority to search barns and cellars. In mid-July 1794, Tax Inspector John Neville and U.S. Marshal David Lennox tried to serve subpoenas to farmers who hadn't registered their stills as required by law. In retaliation, protesters burned Neville's house and fired at Lennox. The situation escalated as 6,000 rebels gathered at Braddock's Field near Pittsburgh, calling for a public safety committee and later even invoking the guillotine. On August 7th, Washington issued a proclamation calling for militia and warning the rebels to disband by September 1st. The same day, Knox notified the governors of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Virginia to prepare 13,000 militiamen to suppress the rebellion. He also sent a 3-member committee, led by Attorney General Bradford, to negotiate with the rebels. With Knox absent due to debt issues, Hamilton took temporary command, despite his pregnant wife and a sick child. Jefferson was particularly unhappy with Hamilton's war authority. As unrest spread to Maryland and other states, 62-year-old Washington decided to lead the expedition himself. He warned his soldiers not to harm the rebels unnecessarily and leave punishment to civil courts. Washington, Hamilton, and Henry Lee planned a 2-pronged advance on Pittsburgh, executed in late October. The rebellion was quickly quelled. About 150 prisoners were detained, and after 2 leaders were sentenced to death, Washington exercised his constitutional power to pardon them, showing both sternness and mercy. Following the Whiskey Rebellion, both Hamilton and Jefferson resigned, significantly changing Washington's cabinet as no one could match their talent. Another major controversy was the 1795 Jay Treaty between the U.S. and Britain, negotiated by Chief Justice John Jay, sent by Washington. After the Revolutionary War, some British troops remained in the Western territories, causing tension and insecurity in America. Without warning American officials, Britain captured nearly 300 U.S. merchant ships. The Jay Treaty resolved these issues, with Britain agreeing to compensate for the seized ships. Pro-French Jefferson saw the treaty as a major threat to American Republican values, leading to a complete fallout between him and Washington. Jefferson orchestrated a media campaign portraying Washington as a puppet for the Federalists, manipulating the public. These criticisms angered and exhausted Washington, solidifying his decision not to seek a third term. On March 4, 1797, Washington gave a brief farewell address, filling the hall with profound sadness. The room was filled with crying, with tears streaming down everyone's faces, including Washington's. This time, he was truly leaving, with memories of his roles as Commander-in-Chief and President flooding back. The father of America retired, relieved, having maintained a perfect image throughout. Washington's achievements were astounding, proving him the ideal leader to guide America from a colonial past to a more democratic future. Even Jefferson, reflecting 15 years later, said, "On the whole, his character was, in its mass, perfect, in nothing bad, in few points indifferent, and it may truly be said that never did nature and fortune combine more perfectly to make a man great." In his remaining years, Washington returned to being a plantation owner, though his financial situation was poor, as he had devoted his time to public service, leading to the decline of his plantation. On Thursday, December 12, 1799, in terrible weather and heavy rain, Washington rode out to inspect his farm, getting soaked. The next day, he developed a sore throat, hoarseness, and chest congestion. He refused medicine, hoping to overcome the illness naturally. By the 3rd day, he had difficulty breathing, and a doctor was called. Washington nearly choked while swallowing medicine. The doctor resorted to bloodletting, an outdated treatment which didn't help. Other summoned doctors continued bloodletting, removing about half his total blood volume, leaving him weak. Realizing he was dying, Washington accepted his fate. That night, he struggled to breathe until he finally passed away at age 67. For 25 years, he had steadfastly pursued the path to establishing an independent republic, enacting the Constitution, and forming the federal government. Few leaders in history have sincerely strived to do the right thing for both themselves and their country. He was truly indispensable to the American Revolution. Henry Lee III famously eulogized him, "First in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen."